Hi, welcome to another Synth and Software video. So, MIDI 2.0. People have been talking about the need for something with that name since MIDI 1.0 was still in diapers, but now it really does sound imminent. Cool, I want it. Does that mean we get to buy everything we already own all over again? Spoiler alert, no. In fact, musicians who don't own a single piece of MIDI 2 hardware will still benefit from it. Here to dig beyond the hype is Mr. Athan Billias, who, in addition to being well known as an executive at Yamaha, is the MIDI Association's COO. What I didn't know is that he was involved in the Korg M1, nor did I know that it's the highest selling synth of all time. Anyway, the MIDI Association is who's responsible for the MIDI 2.0 standard. It's a non-profit trade organization that serves companies that make MIDI products, along with some 32,000 people like you and me who make art with MIDI. It's free to join at the MIDI.org website.
We are recording and we are here with Nick Batzdorf from Synth and Software. Welcome. I guess you could say welcome to me too. So
Yeah, well, thank you for doing this.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Okay, should I put off buying all the MIDI gear I've been planning to buy? I've been having my eye on the synthesizer that it's really great, except it's MIDI 1. Does that mean it's going to be superseded, next week by MIDI 2?
There are billions, literally billions of MIDI-enabled devices on the planet. So the primary thing that we had to think about was, how do we create a path to do something new while maintaining backward compatibility with MIDI 1.0? And that was number one on the list of requirements for MIDI 2.0. And I have to give credit where credit is due. Mike Kent, who is a gentleman who worked for many years for Roland R&D. He actually worked for Japan for many years. He wrote the USB MIDI 1.0 spec in 1998. So almost everybody who uses MIDI and connects it with USB is indebted to the work that he did many years ago. He came up with it's a kind of Occam's razor, very simple solution. And so what he posited was that if we assumed bidirectionality, because MIDI 1.0, just because of the physical way it was done, had a separate in and out. So you could never determine whether the in and the out were both connected. So you could never assume bidirectionality. However, all modern transports, whether it's Bluetooth or USB or Ethernet, all modern transports are bidirectional. So Mike said, well, what if we assumed bidirectionality? And so the first thing we do with MIDI CI, which is the basis of everything that happens in MIDI 2.0, if we just ask the question, can you do something new? And so MIDI CI goes out and it says, do you understand MIDI CI? And if it gets no response, it goes, oh, well, you're a MIDI 1.0 device. And it just continues to send MIDI 1.0 messages. So every device that you buy, 20 years from now, you will still be able to plug in your DX7 to your MIDI system. I mean, that was kind of our mantra, is like, can you plug in a DX7 and will it work? And so there is no necessary reason to wait. And one thing I will say is, it is amazing what you can do with MIDI 1.0. That was another challenge we had, because if you see all of the things that have been done with MPE, that have been done with Bluetooth MIDI recently, with wireless MIDI, MIDI 1.0 does a whole bunch of amazing stuff, and all of those products will work, and they will also work in the ecosystem of MIDI 2.0 as well. So the first question is, do you need to wait? No. And here's the other thing that's really interesting. So when we started to get into it, we said, okay, you can do bidirectionality on a 5-pin DIN plug. You just have to plug the in and the out, both of them in. You have to connect up both sides of the in and out, which is fine. You can run 2 of the current 3 things that you can do with MIDI 2.0. You can run them on 5-pin DIN. So there are 3 categories of MIDI 2.0. There are profiles, there is property exchange, and then there is protocol negotiation. It could be a little bit confusing because MIDI 2.0 is this big suite of things that gives you all sorts of new capabilities. The thing that I always tell people, all you need to remember is MIDI 2.0 equals bidirectional communication. And what does that mean? It means that two devices can start to talk to each other and understand what the person, the device out there does. They can start communicating and configuring themselves automatically. And that really is really powerful, because one of the challenges with MIDI is it can be very daunting to a novice user. It can be daunting. I've been using MIDI for a long time, and, you know, editing NRPNs is not something that I look forward to ever. And I don't think anybody does. You know, it can be very, very complicated. So this is going to allow things to configure themselves. So what does that mean? It means that you could buy a device now, and that manufacturer could decide to upgrade it with if it's a hardware piece, they could decide to upgrade it with a piece of firmware. It could get something that was like a little MIDI 2.0 shim that acted as a proxy and sat in between the hardware and a DAW to give it some MIDI 2.0 capabilities. You know, if you remember back, and I do because I'm that old, when MIDI was first introduced, the first years when MIDI was introduced, like every NAMM show was like, you know, Christmas on steroids. You went there and there were these new things where you went, oh my God, it does this. Oh my God, it can do this now. We really see that happening. And because there are so many different MIDI 1.0 devices, we see this incredibly healthy marketplace in, you know, in terms of these software packages that will help MIDI 1.0 devices integrate it even further into the MIDI 2.0 ecosystem. The other question that we get a lot is, do I need to buy a new cable? Do I have to, you know, not only do I have to replace my gear, which you don't, do I have to buy new cables? No. Again, profiles and property exchange can be done on a 5-pin DIN. So you can use it on that. We believe that about 80% of the people who connect now with MIDI do it via USB. That's the kind of the dominant transport. And we have already finalized with the USB IF, the MIDI 2.0 transport. And the way that that works is it will be one driver that will see whether you're running a MIDI 1.0 or a MIDI 2.0 device, just like USB. You don't think about when you're plugging a USB peripheral in, whether it's a USB 1, 2, 3, or 4 device. You just plug it into the USB, and the technology figures it out. So that's what we've done. You know, again, focusing on backwards compatibility.
One of the things we talked about yesterday was with sample libraries, articulation switching, where the note itself knows what articulation to play, including substitutions. We
said we had 3 areas of MIDI 2.0. You have profiles, and a profile, we always use the example of a drawbar organ because it's a very easy analogy to understand. General MIDI was very close to a profile. So what a profile does is it says, this device is going to respond to a certain set of MIDI messages in a clearly defined way. So if you turn on a drawbar organ profile, that drawbar organ soft synth knows that it should respond to the 9 controllers for drawbars. So it's kind of like MIDI learn on steroids. Like you send one message and it just sets the entire device up or a set of channels up to do a very specific thing. And you can have, you know, port-wide profiles, or you can have single channel profiles. So you can have multiple profiles in, you know, in a multi-timbral context. Property exchange is kind of where profile is a macro. Property exchange is like a micro. A property exchange is a very detailed query that says, on oscillator number 5, what is the cutoff frequency? Right? So, and property exchange is done with JSON, and you know, a lot of people understand JSON because it's a well understood thing that is used in web development. The main thing about JSON is it's done so that it is actually human readable. you can see a JSON message and it's not in hex code. If you look at the JSON for cutoff frequency, it will say cutoff frequency 78. So a human being can actually read the messages. Even more importantly, a machine can read the JSON and display it. So we have the capability now, we've done some demos, where you have a hardware device and you have a schema for what's called a JSON schema. It's like the architecture of that hardware device is described in JSON. And then an editor is built without anybody building it. The JSON actually takes the whole structure and all of the information and places it on a screen and lays out, how things are done. So we're entering in this new world. That's a great example of this new world where machines are communicating with each other, and they're taking the burden off of human beings so they can just be creative. Everybody that I know always has that experience of sitting down and I'm going to write a song or even I'm going to create a sound. And then 10 minutes into that creative experience, they're looking for a PDF of the manual for the product that they're working on. And their left brain and their right brain is fighting with each other, and they never get to the creative aspect. So, what we want to do is put those creative people first and allow them to be creative, and just simply put all of the magic of configuration and let the machines do that, because quite frankly, they're really good at it. They don't make mistakes. We tend to make mistakes when we set things up, and machines don't do that. If they're programmed correctly, they'll connect and they'll do the right thing. So that's profiles and property exchange. And the third leg of the MIDI 2.0 initiative is actually a completely new protocol. And the completely new protocol is more MIDI. So you'll see a note on, you'll see a note off, you'll see velocity, you'll see controllers. There's just more of all of those things. For example, velocity is not 7 bits, it's now 16 bits. So you have much more control over velocity. And one of the things that we added to the note on is what we call an attribute type. Now we picked a very generic name for it because we don't know what people are going to want to do to put what information they want to put into a note on. I'll give you an example. MIDI gets used for lighting control. So in the attribute type, you could put colors, you could put DMX universes, right? So you could put a lot of different information in there that would make the note on more powerful. But one of the things we started to work on was this concept of, it was an area which called out for standardization. So there are many, 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 many wonderful software synths, and there are many, many great orchestral libraries. We have a shared friend, Peter Schwartz. He actually a few years ago developed this program called Ski Switcher, and it was this really complicated scripting. So you could take all of these different libraries that all had different methods for doing key switching. So they did key switching, and they used maybe the bottom, 24 notes of a keyboard to switch between articulations, but every single one was a little bit different. So we kind of said, what would it look like in a world where it didn't matter what library you selected, all of the articulations were standardized? And so we set out on this goal of standardizing articulations. And the other thing that we did early on, and again, I credit Peter for this, Peter said one of the things that composers definitely want to be able to do is they want to be able to write something for a trumpet and then switch it to a flute and have the articulations do something meaningful. And so we spent a lot of time. We spent almost a year working on it as a Yamaha project with Mike Kent and Andrew Mee and Peter Schwartz and Ben Israel. And we developed it up to a very good level. We've spent about another 8 months working with Nicholas Jerome, who is the person who wrote the scripting for Contact. So he works for Native Instruments. So he is a developer of sample libraries. Chris Stone, who is an LA guy, runs a company called Audio Impressions, and he, does very high-end orchestral libraries, knows every articulation. Interesting about both Peter and Chris, they do a lot of work, in actual film scoring. So they go between the world of MIDI mock-ups, and then they have to take that MIDI mock-up and they have to go to a real orchestra. And there are differences between what happens in the world of MIDI and what happens in the real world of orchestral players. And they are experts in that. So they gave us a lot of insight into how do we translate, those things so that they will also make sense. Now, it's important to note that all we can do at this point with the note articulation is it selects a note on and also a note off, but it selects the articulation for the note on. It cannot do things like a crescendo that goes over a number of a number of notes, right? Because that's out of bounds of the note on. But we think that what we're doing with the orchestral articulation, it could completely revolutionize the way film scoring is done and save a lot of time. And we have so many great things in the history of MIDI. Do you know Jeff Rona at all? Have you ever? Yeah. So Jeff was the first president of the MIDI Manufacturers Association back in 1985. And then he went on to work for many years for Hans Zimmer. And then he started his own company, and he does film scoring at a very high level. But we were able to go to people like Jeff and go, would this be something that you would use in your work? And he was like, are you kidding me? Of course, this is exactly the kind of thing that film composers have been wanting for so long. Now, we're about to have a meeting with a fairly large group of sample developers in about a week or so, and they will have input on it. People have to understand that the process of making standards that get used globally around the world, it's just not easy. It's a lot of very hard work. It's a lot of, detailed drudgery, quite frankly, in terms of writing a specification so that anybody anywhere in the world can read it and make something from it. But I have to say, we're pretty excited about, not just the orchestral articulations, but there are so many things we have published since the core MIDI 2.0 documents. There are now 15 specifications that we have published, which is more specifications than the MIDI Association has published in the last 15 years in 1 year. So, that's pretty good.
One of the problems with key switches is note chasing issues. But it seems like having that being part of the note itself would solve a lot of problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things when we started to dig into it, if you look at some DAWs, for example, Cubase, Nuendo, and also Logic, they already have the ability to do per note articulation and per note expression. And so they were kind of waiting for that external standardized protocol to allow them to take even more advantage of what they were doing internally. And particularly in the case of articulations, I don't know what DAW you use, but a lot of the DAWs, they have the ability to do per note articulations, but now it will be inside of the MIDI note on to make it so much easier for them to just go, yeah, I'm just going to put it in that particular lane where I do the editing and translate it much more directly. It is pretty interesting the way the things are kind of working out in terms of the software moved ahead pretty quickly, and MIDI was, quite frankly, it was a little bit behind. It was still 7-bit, and it didn't have the resolution and all of those things. We have caught up a great deal, but we've done it in a way so that we're still very confident, and this is important to note, that you can run it on an Arduino. right? So if as long as you have the speed in the transport to send the very thick data, it's not that complicated. And we always worked to make sure that a low-powered device, in terms of a low-powered CPU, would be able to process things. The way we did property exchange is a great example. It puts all of the weight of filtering and doing the database onto a computer or a smartphone, or something with a lot of processing power. But it still allows a little Arduino to be able to just have a little teeny display and go cutoff 74. So again, one of the challenges we have is, I always say MIDI is a really big tent and it's got to fit everybody in, but there's plenty of room there. So, we always have to make sure that hardware companies are happy with it. Software companies are also happy with it. And even, the kind of hacker world, people who wanted the maker world, they need to be also happy with it and be able to use it. So a challenge, but we like that challenge.
Roland, I think already has a controller keyboard that speaks MIDI 2.
It does not speak MIDI 2 yet. What Roland said, and they were very clear about it, they said it is MIDI 2 ready.
Okay.
We can kind of talk about where we are. Again, certain parts of MIDI 2.0, like profiles and property exchange, I think you will see very soon, because it doesn't need the new protocol. To actually do the whole protocol, we need class compliant drivers from the operating system companies. Mm-hmm. And that's why, I can't tell you when Apple's going to release something, or Microsoft or Google. I value my life. So, they can't, they're publicly traded companies. They simply can't, do future facing, predictions of what they do. And all of that's understood. But what I can very clearly say is that they are all members and they all approved MIDI 2.0. So that doesn't say that they will ever do anything with MIDI 2.0. It doesn't say they won't. And also they are very active participants in the organization. So
I play a MIDI 2 device with a MIDI 1 controller. Will it interpolate between the controller messages, the 127 values in MIDI 1?
Part of the MIDI 2.0 specification, if you read it, and it is publicly available, is how to do translation, in both directions. Again, that was the core thing, is how do we keep backwards compatibility? And how that happens may be different in different operating systems. If you have an operating system that has a central MIDI server, and there are some operating systems that have that, and there are some other operating systems that are looking at that type of system, it could be completely transparent to the user. They plug a device in, it doesn't matter. Inside of the operating system, it will translate. We were just talking this morning about, for example, orchestral articulations. We will probably include some information in the orchestral articulation profile or a white paper that we do that says, okay, I have a MIDI 1.0 controller and it just sends out key switches. Well, how do I translate those key switches into MIDI 2.0 articulation attribute types? It's a mapping problem. It's not even a technology problem. It's I have to make a gigantic Excel sheet and do it problem. In fact, there's no technology involved there. And so we think that people will be able to do those kinds of things, and we will do as much as we possibly can to help implementers to get those things correct. And we actually do have tools which we provide to our members for doing compliance testing, to say, I sent a MIDI 2.0 note on message with this articulation attribute, and did it get to the other side, and did it actually, go to the receiver and do what it was expected to do. So, yeah, I mean, all of that stuff is just, things you have to do when you're launching a new technology.
But it sounds to me like it's not like a gate that just opens. It's going to be, they're going to be some things that it's going to be a gradual transition. Is that a fair assessment?
It's absolutely a fair assessment. And you know, you asked, I think one of the questions you ask is how long will MIDI 1.0 devices be in the marketplace? You know, I can see 15 years from now that there's a foot pedal that's just, it's a MIDI 1.0 device. It does not need 4 billion, you know, points of resolution. You know, if it's a very simple switch, it's just, you know, on and off, and you just, you know,
that makes sense. Yeah.
2 billion is off and 2 billion and 1 is on. You know,
yeah.
So, you know, that's, you know, but a MIDI 1.0 devices, I think it depends on what the application is. And you can certainly see, you know, even something that's like fairly complicated in terms of what it does sound-wise, like a digital piano, you know, you could see that being years where it's still perfectly valid. But I do think you are correct. You will see a gradual process. I firmly believe that you will see some MIDI 2.0 compatible devices in the marketplace this year, probably devices that use the MIDI 1.0 protocol. So you will see profiles, things that support profiles and things that support property exchange this year. And then it's a matter of the operating systems. I believe that the infrastructure is going to be there. And again, we have all of the right players. One thing I will say, because I know you have a lot of people who, you know, are into saw synths. Steinberg has clearly said, all you need to do to support MIDI 2.0 is use the VST3 SDK. If you are a plugin developer, you do not have to do anything. It will work with MIDI 2.0. They said, yes, we are ready for MIDI 2.0. And if MIDI 3.0 comes out, we're probably ready for that too. It's software. And so they don't have any of the limitations that an embedded system developer has. But again, we got to go the full range from that little Arduino all the way up to your newest Macintosh or Windows or you know, Google computer.
Is there anything else I should have asked you?
Well, I think there is one thing. You should ask me, how can I join the free-to-join community of people who work, play, and create with MIDI? And the answer is just go to MIDI.org, MIDI.org. It's free to join. We send out a newsletter maybe once a month. You know, we are not in the business of selling things to people, so you don't get lots of emails about buy this from the MIDI Association. You get emails about the latest news on what's happening with MIDI. And, you know, there are always so many cool stories about what people do with MIDI. Try to keep it entertaining.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad I asked that question. Listen, thanks so much, Athan. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks for watching. And just a reminder to please come visit synthandsoftware.com. And while you're there, please be sure to subscribe. You'll get a lot of great information, and you'll be doing your part to support professional music tech journalism.